one of the striking things about people I've spoke to in the Revolutionary Guards was that they had a very strong ideological position, but they were quite thoughtful and understood the risks that Iran was involved in. So some of them will be saying, hang on a second, do we want to throw all this away? And bear in mind, Aisha, that consent, even the sullen consent of the vast majority of the population in Iran has gone.
Let's return to our top story this afternoon, the situation in the Middle East, which is getting more and more tense every day. The Prime Minister is once again calling on Brits to leave Lebanon as fighting between Israel and Hezbollah intensifies. The first government-chartered flight left Beirut on Wednesday, but it's not clear how long the airport can actually remain open for, with reports of strikes hitting areas near the airport. Now, around 700 British troops are now in Cyprus, just in case any emergency evacuation is needed. Keir Starmer says that he has been speaking to world leaders about this.
I've been talking to the President of the United States, to the G7 countries, and to the Prime Minister in Israel. I am concerned that this is on the brink, and I am concerned that we do everything we can to de-escalate the situation.
Meanwhile, the world is watching to see what action Israel now takes against Iran following Tuesday's massive missile attack. Today, Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, has defended his country's action, calling it a minimum punishment for Israel's assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. He was addressing a large crowd at the Tehran Grand Mosque earlier today, where the life of Nasrallah was commemorated.
و در آینده هم اگر لازم شد باز انجام خواهد گرفت.
He was speaking after Friday prayers, the first time he's done so for nearly 5 years. So it was quite a moment. Khamenei called for solidarity amongst Islamic nations, saying that the enemy of Iran is the enemy of Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, Syria and Yemen. He said that defending the Palestinians is legitimate and helping them is also legitimate. So it really feels like the focus on the conversation right now is between Israel and Iran, and somebody who knows all about what it's like to negotiate with Iran and knows the situation very, very well is Jack Straw, who was Labour's Foreign Secretary between 2001 and 2006. He was actually involved in negotiations with Iran over its nuclear ambitions. Jack, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's just start with, your kind of reflections on where things are right now.
Well, the situation is very, very serious, and it's probably the most serious time in the Middle East that we've had since the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The Israelis have obviously made a decision to do their best to crush Hamas and Hezbollah. I think they're partly succeeding in that. The Iranians, in my judgment, really are gambling for very, very high stakes indeed. And part of their problem is that they feel pushed into a corner. Their whole defensive strategy was based on the belief that they'd have forward defense, as they called it, in terms of having Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza, and the Houthis in the Yemen. And the idea of that was that they would really provide a buffer between Israel and Iran. Now, Israel is unquestionably undermining the military capability of Hamas and increasingly of Hezbollah. So it leaves Iran very exposed. Khamenei is, in my view, the last person sensibly to lead Iran out of this situation. He's 85. He spent a lifetime fighting what he regards as the enemies of the Islamic Republic. He was very badly injured in 1981 in an assassination attempt. He's lost the use of his right arm, and he's incredibly bitter. He's also very isolated. So he's made a point almost of never going outside the country in the years since he became supreme leader in 1989. And in the period that he was president, between 81 and 89, he only went to the neighboring countries in any event. He's very isolated, and he's been saying some really sort of off-the-wall things. So, for example, he a couple of days ago, he said, quotes, "With God's help, the resistant fronts," that's those of Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on, and Iran, their blows against the dilapidated and decaying body of the Zionist regime, that's Israel, will become more crushing. He said, and victory from God and conquest is near. Now, that's not the case. And he's fantasizing about this. That would be all right if he's just an old man having a fantasy, but he leads the country of 88 million. And the fundamental problem for the Islamic Republic, amongst many others, their economic decrepitude and so on, is that they have, well, not originally, but from certainly since Khamenei has been there, refused to recognize even that Israel exists.
Right.
So they can't say the words. So they can't call it Israel. They call it the Zionist entity. They talk about a Palestine from the river to the sea and all this stuff. They ignore the fact that Israel was recognized as an independent state in 1949 by the United Nations. It's there. There's no possibility of it not being a state. So that's the problem you've got.
So, I mean, you've kind of painted a very useful picture of who is ruling Iran and the kind of message, which is incredibly hardline. But even though the language and the rhetoric is very tough, do you think Iran actually does want to see an escalation into a sort of full-on sort of regional war? And what do you think Israel is likely to do in retaliation?
Well, one of the interesting things about Iran is that although ultimately there's one man who's been there a very long time, Ayatollah Khamenei, who makes the decisions, there is quite a lot of discussion, some of it pretty open, about the political direction the country should take. I don't know, but I'll surmise that there's a lot of debate going on at the moment amongst senior military and security figures and politicians
in Iran.
About what the devil they do. Now, it's some years since I've been to Iran. It's not literally not safe for even Brits like me to travel there these days. But in 2018, I went to a conference and listened and talked to representatives of the army, the ordinary army, and they've also got the Revolutionary Guards. One of which are the Praetorian Guard of Iran. One of the striking things about people I've spoke to in the Revolutionary Guards was that they had a very strong ideological position, but they were quite thoughtful and understood the risks that Iran was involved in, which so some of them will be saying, hang on a second, do we want to throw all this away? And bear in mind, Aisha, that the consent, even the sullen consent of the vast majority of the population in Iran has gone. And it went 2 years ago for people who I've spoken to, whose view I trust, who are on the ground all the time in Iran, after the police murder of that young woman, Mahsa Amini, in 2022. So the best estimates are that about 80% of the population have lost any sort of faith in the system and can't wait to remove it.
But
You've
on
then
that,
got,
Jack, even though, as you say, this the 80%, and we know that we've seen the women come out on the streets and horrible crackdowns on women, young people, men have supported women as well. But the regime has cracked down in a very authoritarian, a very violent way against any uprising. I mean, if people did want to sort of uprise against the leadership, what chance have they got when so far people have been brutalised, they've been arrested, they've been murdered? What kind of chance of change is likely to happen?
you're right, that the other 20% have all the arrangements for, excuse me one second, they've got all the arrangements and security for crushing opposition. But there can come a moment in a society which is this fractured, where things just go quite quickly belly up. Now, I don't know, nobody I speak to who's far better informed than I am on Iran can judge when it will go belly up. But at some stage it will, because you've got to be there to understand the insecurity of the leaders. Khamenei, the supreme leader, is not going to be there for very much longer. Now, if you said to me, well, weren't you being briefed on that 20 years ago, Jack, when you were foreign secretary? I'd say yes, and he certainly showed, notwithstanding his injuries, great powers of survival. But he is 85, and he's not in good health.
But then who would come next, Jack? And is that and forgive me for saying this, is that not kind of classic Western optimism bias, thinking, look, he'll be gone soon, but I'm sure whoever comes will be better. Somebody better might not come.
I think that when he goes, that it's not optimism bias. Although I take the point by me at all. I think there'll be a terrible mess, and it could be a worse crackdown. Certainly, the Revolutionary Guards will seek to impose their will. But it may not necessarily be as strongly religious as it has been in the past, where the state seeks to interfere in the private lives of people, especially of women, and hence this. They're not stupid. The religious hardliners. The reason why they insist on the wearing of the headscarf by women is to make a point that this, you've got to obey what we tell you. But I mean, the women are bursting to get rid of their headscarves. If you're in Tehran or other centres, they've shoved the headscarves as far back down there.
Well, I mean,
head as they can. Iran, the take up of makeup and mascara in Iran is amongst the per head is amongst the highest in the world, and they're bursting to be able to express themselves and to be given freedom.
Absolutely. Well, look, Jack,
I don't know. Sorry, I just finished the point. I don't know. It could be years. It could be months. But as the Shah discovered in 1978-79, when he was repressing things and people were saying he'd last for a long time, suddenly things can happen. It's bloody and violent, but that, I'm afraid, is the history of Iran. And then the whole thing goes up.
Well, look, I mean, certainly as a Muslim woman myself, my heart breaks for the oppression that those poor women find themselves under. And of course, let's not even begin in terms of what's happening to women in Afghanistan right now. Well, look, Jack, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I just wanted to ask you a broader question about what you think is going to happen in the region next, and whether there is any chance of a ceasefire in Gaza when everything is so tense now and Lebanon is in play.
I don't see really anything happening until there's a conclusion to the American elections. So Netanyahu will be hanging on in the hope that his best friend, Donald Trump, wins the American election, in which case he'll have the Americans behind him in a completely unequivocal way. If Kamala Harris wins, on the other hand, she will, I think, become more of a constraining force on the Israelis than Biden has been, because Biden traditionally very powerfully in favor of the Israelis, almost regardless of what they're doing. So I think for Hezbollah and Hamas, although they've taken terrible beatings, they haven't got much. Their whole sort of raison d'etre, it's a terrible thing to say, has been about conflict and killing. And neither Hamas nor Hezbollah has taken that much care of its own population, as illustrated by the fact that Hamas launched this completely unprovoked attack, killed over 1,200 Israeli citizens. They were civilians in the main. And in doing so, provoked this war. So it is bleak, and I think it's going to stay bleak at least until the turn of the year.
Yeah. And final question to you, Jack. You obviously were very heavily involved in Tony Blair's new Labour government. We now have a new Labour government under Keir Starmer, but it has got off to a bit of a difficult start. There's been difficult headlines over freebies. There's been, leaks and from number 10 doesn't seem like a terribly happy place. What's your kind of assessment of how the new Labour government is doing, and does it compare to when Tony Blair first started? Because he had his difficulties over things like cuts to lone parents in terms of benefits, the issue with Bernie Ecclestone. Do you think these are teething problems, or do you think there's something deeper?
Well, it's very difficult to say. What some are saying is, including in the right-wing press, that Keir Starmer and co having a much more difficult time than Tony Blair had, and it was all fine under Tony Blair. Actually, it didn't feel like that. And I remember when the Bernie Ecclestone issue arose. Now, that was about the fact that we, the Labour Party, had taken £1 million. Bear in mind, this is 27 years ago, from Bernie Ecclestone. And there was a kind of implication that in return for this £1 million, we would tone down on the restrictions on tobacco advertising, not least on Formula One and Formula One competitions, which he was running. And there was other stuff going on as well. So I think it's the right-wing press, who, although the sale of newspapers these days is many fewer than it was 27 years ago, for all the reasons we know, they remain very influential indeed, because it's what you guys look at. The people in your newsrooms, in other, as it were, digital newsrooms, look at first is what's being what the agenda is that's being set.
Just to push back that I mean, that's always been the case. I mean, the press has always, whether you love the press or hate the press, and a lot of my listeners, and of course I'm a Labour person as well, but a lot of listeners have just been a bit dismayed about this, not so much in terms of, they can make up their mind in terms of they're pretty smart people, but they're just a bit concerned, particularly when people are having quite a hard time. And Keir Starmer said, we're going to sort of really try and put trust back into politics.
Well, look, I understand the point you're making, and the issues of.
Do you think it's been well handled?
Partly and partly not, and I think that the administration was slightly caught off guard, particularly on this issue of gifts, because quite rightly there is now, pushed by the Labour Party in opposition, much greater transparency than there was, say, 27 years ago over gifts in kind. But it's absolutely fair to say that in all these cases, the reason that the details are known is because these cabinet ministers and other senior members of this government have been very open and explicit and observant of the rules in saying these are the gifts that we've taken. The prior issue, of course, was about the optics of this. How would it look when those gifts became well known? And I think on that, it's not been handled in the most brilliant way. Put it that way.
Okay.
And so it's a learning situation, but it doesn't alter the fact, in my view, that, and I just spent the last 2 days in my former constituency in Blackburn, that although people are slightly concerned about this, they're overwhelmingly pleased about the fact you've got a coherent government, which is now doing the business on the health service, on education, and trying to operate in a coherent way.